Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 o'clock on my clock, so we're going to get this webcast started. Thanks again to all of you who have joined us for today's Open for Business, what every Utah employer should know before resuming business, or for that matter, reactivating your business. My name is Jason Castor, and I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer, and I'd like to extend a special thanks to all of you for participating in today's webcast. As you may know, we have been doing a series of these webcasts over the course of the better part of the last, say, 6-7 weeks. And we are thrilled to have Visit Salt Lake as our co-host today. So thanks a lot to all of you for participating. I want to go over quickly the format of today's webinar. All of your lines will be muted. We will encourage you to submit questions throughout today's presentation. Please submit those to me, Jason Castor, as the host through the chat feature. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be providing all participants with not only a recording to the webinar, but also today's slide deck. As we move along, I must start with a legal disclaimer and let you know that today's presentation is a source of general information and should not be considered as legal advice. If you have any questions about how this relates to your business, you must consult with your legal counsel. So now that we've got formalities behind us, again, thanks a lot for participating in this webcast. We're grateful to Visit Salt Lake for partnering with us today. And now I'd like to introduce Judy Cullen, Vice President of Partner Development for Visit Salt Lake. Judy?
Thanks, Jason. And let me echo Jason's thanks to all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. I'm sure many of you know that Visit Salt Lake has been hosting quite a few webinars lately, trying to keep our members and partners up to speed on what's going on in this rapidly changing environment. But most of those have dealt with safety and sanitation and the guidelines that the governor has put together as we phase from red to orange. And we really haven't addressed some of the legal issues that are a part of this new landscape as well. So when we were contacted by Parsons Bailey, we were really happy to be able to co-host the seminar with them. I think that you'll find this information very, very helpful. Before I turn it over to Christina, I just want to remind everyone, however, that our website, visitsaltlake.com, has a lot of resources available for you. We're trying to keep that updated as information changes, but I suggest that if you do have questions, you go to that website first. And if you don't find the answer, please feel free to reach out to me or any of my team at Visit Salt Lake, jcullen@visitsaltlake.com. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn the rest of the time over to these wonderful attorneys from Parsons Bailey. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. My name is Christina Jepson, and I'm an employment lawyer at Parsons Bailey and Latimer. I have two of my colleagues with me today, Sean Monson and Susan Mottschler. We're all employment lawyers. We've been doing this for a long time. I've been with the firm for 25 years, and our firm has been around since the 1800s. So we have a lot of experience, and we're trying to help employers do what they need to during this difficult time. Everyone's concerned about the safety of their employees and the well-being of their customers. There's also some liability concerns you should keep in mind as you're reopening or changing what you're doing during this pandemic. You may have noticed that there have been a lot of lawsuits filed across the country against different employers, against Walmart, against meat packing companies, all different kinds of employers, basically contending that the employee contracted COVID at work, or they contracted it at work and gave it to someone in their family who then died. And so, these can be, really devastating lawsuits because usually workers' comp would not apply to this situation, which means there's not workers' comp coverage and there's not immunity from lawsuits. So there is that risk. Now, you may know that Utah has passed a statute that gives a lot of protection to employers who are opening during this situation, but it's not absolute immunity. The new statute still allows people to bring lawsuits if an employer is reckless or they're intentional. And also the statute might be held unconstitutional. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. And really, you need to make sure that you're following all the guidelines that are out there, CDC, OSHA, state, local guidelines. And if you're doing that and you have good plans and good written plans, that's really the best you can do to protect your employees and protect yourself from a lawsuit. So that's what we're going to be talking about quite a bit today. Now I'm going to go over the schedule. We have quite a bit to cover, so bear with us. We're going to get through this as quickly as we can. Originally, we were just going to cover sort of the employment topics, but Judy let us know that you were interested in force majeure. So yesterday, we were able to get Tom Beckett at our firm signed on at the very last second to go over force majeure. So we're going to start with Tom talking about that. Then we're going to move to Susan Mottschler, who's going to talk about creating an opening plan or continuing operations plan. Then I'm going to talk about temperature testing, symptom screening, and vulnerable employees. Sean Monson's going to talk about PPE, protective equipment, and positive cases. And then if we have time, I'm going to talk a little more about specific Utah hospitality industry standards. So that is the plan for today. And I think the next thing we're going to do is go right into force majeure with Tom.
Thanks, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, Tom.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's do force majeure very quickly. And next slide, Jason. So what's the purpose? Let me start with an insanely high altitude observation that in general, contracts define the party's performance, okay? But the problem is sometimes a party can't perform under a contract because of unanticipated circumstances beyond its control. For example, COVID-19 and the economic shock. Next slide, please. So the question is the non-performing party liable for damages? In other words, how did the parties agree to allocate the risk of loss attributable to disasters out of their control? The answer is it depends on what the contract says in the force majeure clause. There's nothing mystical about force majeure. These clauses are read literally. Next slide. What I'd like to do is walk you through a typical force majeure clause. There are 3 subclauses, and I'll do them in order. The performance of this agreement, it says, is subject to termination without liability upon the occurrence of any circumstance beyond the control of either party. So this is what we're talking about. In other words, a party will not be liable for non-performance if the non-performance is caused by events beyond their control. Next slide. And every force majeure clause has a for example list. Here it says such as acts of God, war, acts of terrorism, government regulations, disasters, strikes, so on and so forth. I think people tend to get hung up in this clause, looking where is pandemic in that list. It's not there, but that's fine because this is just illustrative. It's not exclusive. And the question was, did something happen that was beyond the control of either party? Next slide. So the non-performing party is excused, as said above, to the extent such circumstance made it illegal or impossible for, in this case, the hotel to provide or for groups in general to use the hotel facility. So the words in this clause, this is the whole clause, the words illegal or impossible are the most important. It might have said illegal, inadvisable, or impossible, but just ask yourself when you're looking at an event, is it impossible to hold? It's difficult for things to be impossible. Is it illegal? Not after opening up. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with 4 observations. First is people get hung up also on common law doctrines such as impossibility, but they really have little or no relevance in contracts that contain force majeure clauses. If you argue the common law to the judge will say, hey, look, you guys negotiated how to allocate risk of non-performance, and so the judge will stick with that clause. Again, as I said before, there's no deep hidden meaning. Force majeure clauses will be enforced strictly according to their terms. The example I gave you did not have a time deadline, but look at yours. Many do, and require notification of cancellation of an event, for example, within 30 or 40 days of the onset of whatever event it was. It's been more than 30 days since the coronavirus began to shut down the economy. So look at your contracts carefully, read the clauses carefully, and good luck with your opening up. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tom. We appreciate your observations and your guidance there. We'll now turn the time over to Susan Mott-Schiedler.
Hey, thank you, Jason. So I know y'all, most of the participants on this webinar have had a lot of previous training on creating a plan. So I'm going to gloss over some of those nuts and bolts types of things and talk about sort of the legal ramifications of your plan and specifically talk about documentation and training. So when you're creating your plan, you should still have these overarching considerations, and you should address what I call the 3 Ps, so your physical spaces, people, and policies. And you're going to want to rely on the resources and guidance available. So our main concern is documenting that you're following those guidances and that you are trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Next slide. So documentation and training are key. Prior to going to law school, I was in food and beverage for 15 years, and there was this saying that at first I thought was kind of silly, but it's, if you're not training, you're training. And the truth of the matter is that goes to COVID-19 cleaning procedures and operations procedures and new policies as well. So there's really there's a training hurdle initially that you're going to have to get over and continue. And then documentation is really important. From the legal perspective, if something is not documented, then you really can't demonstrate that it happened very easily. So when we think about documentation, we think about, okay, if I am sued or if you are sued, what are we going to want to look for to demonstrate that we took every precaution and we followed all the rules to make our workplace safe and to make our employees safe and to make our customers safe. And you want to assign that documentation to specific employees so that you know it gets taken care of. And those records can be when and how decisions were made, daily and hourly cleaning schedules, training attendance, attendance at work in case you need to do contact tracing, that sort of thing. And then there are also some confidentiality concerns that you should pay attention to. If you are tracking temperatures or positive results from your employees, make sure that those are set aside in a need-to-know file that's not generally accessed and that isn't part of the regular personnel file. Part of this, you're going to want to appoint a COVID-19 workplace coordinator, and that person will be in charge of making sure that you check all of these boxes, and they could have as much or as little responsibility as they need to have, but they should be able to talk cogently about all of these policies, know what they are, and know who's in charge of the documentation and what you're documenting. Next slide. So physical space. I know that the advice is changing on cleaning, spacing, and that sort of thing. So stay abreast of that, and we'll talk about what kind of guidance there is. But you really want to identify and walk through your space and identify all the things you need to clean and how. You want to then create a protocol to address the issues, and you want to document that protocol and make sure that it addresses all of the places where you could spread the virus. There has been new documentation regarding air handling systems, so you'll want to also look at that. And then you'll want to consult with your landlord, or if you are the landlord, you'll want to consult with businesses in your space about common spaces and communicate your plan for those spaces. Next slide. You'll want to be able to communicate this to people, and that's your employees, your customers, your vendors, that sort of thing. And really, you want to be able to also, you want your employees to be able to communicate to your customers as well, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so training goes a long way there. You will want to document why you are bringing specific people back, or what you are doing to protect certain individuals, and pay attention to discrimination concerns to make sure that you're not bringing back one work group or 5 work groups, but excluding the work group that has protected minorities in it, for example. And you'll want to document what installation of safety features you are putting in place to be able to bring people back into that place. Next slide. You want to document what's going to be required as part of your plan. So are you going to require testing? Are you going to do temperature taking? Christina will talk about that. Are you going to require safety gear, face covering, gloves, cleaning requirements? How have you trained people to use this? And so we all know the mask, a picture of someone wearing a mask that's right below their nose. And obviously that person hasn't had training. So you'll want to make sure that you document everyone in our workforce has been trained. And then also physical distance. And you'll want to train people to implement those physical distancing recommendations. Next slide. You want to make sure that all of your policies, you have them in a row. So you're going to need new policies for cleaning. If you are going to, you should have what you are going to do when you get a COVID-19 positive in your workplace, either from an employee or a customer. Policies for tracking employees or vendors that are in the workspace in case you need to trace. And then create additional policies such as leave policies, sick policies, update your emergency contact list, and make sure that you train your employees on these so that they can also articulate to your customers what it is you're doing to make it a safe place to do business and you're trustworthy. You'll want, again, frequent and regular training. And so, for example, in the restaurant industry, pre-shift meetings, or in the construction industry, safety huddles and meetings, safety measures and issues that you're having, do some additional those sending masks. And you'll want to make sure that you document who is there and what was discussed. Sign it in terms of what
Hey,
you're
Susan,
doing.
sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
This is Jason. Sorry to interrupt you. You're cutting out a little bit. If you could lean into your microphone.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Distribution and documentation. You will want to distribute all these policies and document that you've distributed to employees, or if you send out, for example, an email to your customers, you'll want to document that you've done that. And then you'll want to make sure that you have consistent application and of the policies, and you have consistent discipline of non-compliant employees. And then in terms of following relevant guidance, like I said, next slide, it's changing constantly, and some places are better at notifying you of changes than others, but really you have federal guidance and you have state and local guidance, and then you also have maybe industry guidance. There's some really good industry guidance publications for specific industries like restaurant industries or salons and that sort of thing. But primarily it's CDC, OSHA, State of Utah, and Salt Lake County. Next slide. CDC's overall guidance, here are the 2 most up-to-date links that you will want to look at. The CDC just updated on May 7th for business responses. And so the CDC is very good about noting the different changes that they've made on each date. And then there's a general reopening guidance that's a little bit more broad brush, but covers everything that you're going to need to do. Again, you'll want to identify a workplace coordinator. You want to frequently clean and disinfect your workspaces, decide what you're going to use. Some of you may need to select a new cleaning product because you're going to be cleaning a lot, and cleaning products are expensive. So you might want to switch from Clorox wipes to a spray and that sort of thing. Train your employees how to store and use them, and then increase the physical distance. Those are like the main points of reopening the business. OSHA dives a little bit deeper. There is a great resource page that OSHA puts out. They do not tell you how it is updated, but it's an overview of every resource that they have and guidance on COVID-19 topics. And then there are specific guidelines that apply to certain industries or business locations. And it includes how to use PPE, what PPE you should be using, how to store, label, and use chemicals. It talks about policies and procedures for the cleaning and also identification of positive employees or customers. And then it talks a lot about developing, implementing, and communicating these workplace flexibilities and protections that you're going to have. And then finally, we have for Utah, next slide, the state and local guidance. And these are also somewhat difficult to track down, but primarily there's the state, county, and city. And Salt Lake County follows, it really reflects the state of Utah. But my advice is, read through the state of Utah. There's a lot of shoulds and a lot of musts. And sometimes they're kind of confusing on what is actually required. Salt Lake County, I found, is actually a little bit more clear about what is a must. And it also, though, reflects the state of Utah's guidance. So if you want to know what must I have, you might want to start there and go there first. And then the state of Utah, however, does have very specific guidelines for different industries or facility-specific requirements. So if you have a pool, if you have a nail salon, that sort of thing, there are specific guidelines that apply to you. And that is the sum of my presentation. We do have policies if you need help opening or establishing any of these types of cleaning protocols or leave policies, or need any advice on how to train your employees or resources for that. All of us can help you out with that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susan. So I'm going to be talking a bit about screening for COVID-19, specifically with employees. And there's really three major tools we have in this area. Taking a temperature to find out if an employee has a fever, which of course is one of the symptoms of COVID-19, asking about other symptoms or perhaps even observing them, and then finally asking about potential exposure to COVID-19. Now, of course, normally lawyers would not be telling you to do any of these sorts of things. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, really limits employers from normally asking employees about health conditions. But a pandemic is a very different situation, and in this very specific situation, the EEOC and other government entities have said it is important to ask about these. In fact, like Susan mentioned, the Utah guidelines are a little difficult to understand in terms of what's a must and what's a should, but I overall would read it as temperature taking and screening for symptoms as being more of a must than a should, especially if you're in any industry with a lot of contact between employees or with customers, so restaurants, for example. But in any event, if someone has symptoms, they should not be coming into the workplace. They should stay home and shouldn't come back until they're cleared. Next slide. As Susan mentioned, you should also be keeping a log of these screenings, the temperature taking, whether there's exposure, whether there's symptoms. Those should be kept confidential, kept separate, and only shared on a need-to-know basis. This is not something you're going to be sharing with everyone in the workplace. And temperature taking and other screening has to be non-discriminatory. That means you can't just screen some people. For example, you can't just screen people who you think maybe seem sick, or maybe people who are just older. You really should be screening everyone, including managers, because they're just as capable of becoming sick. So, really make sure it's not discriminatory. Now, if you're going to do temperature taking, you have to start out by setting a criteria for what is going to be considered a fever And in that instance, no one with that temperature will be allowed in the workplace. At the very least, it should be 100.4. That's what the CDC says is a temperature. Some employers are going as low as 100, just maybe to catch a few more fevers. But if someone hits that predetermined criteria, they cannot come to work. And in terms of symptoms, you're going to be asking employees if they have any symptoms. You can either do this verbally, you can do this with an app, you can do this with a survey that's sent to employees that they fill out before they come to work every day. There's a variety of ways of doing this. And the symptoms do change quite a bit. You may recall that in the beginning of this pandemic, we were mostly just looking at a cough and shortness of breath. But as time has gone on, those symptoms on the lower half of the slide were added by the CDC. So now the CDC says if you have a cough or shortness of breath, either of those would be considered symptomatic. And if you have two of the following ones, headache, fever, chills, those sort of things, that also makes you symptomatic. And in those cases, the person should not come to work. You should also be asking people about exposure. Again, this could be done in a survey, in an app, verbally. You could just have a policy that says everyone has to report if they have exposure. But basically, if anyone has exposure, you want to make sure that they do the required quarantining and they don't come back to work until they're cleared. So temperature taking could be done at home. It could also be done at work. The way I read the guidelines is that really restaurants should absolutely be doing it in the workplace. It really kind of depends. Some office environments are just having people take their own temperatures at home. Other environments where you really need to make sure that people are fever-free, you might want to make sure that you have more hands-on with that. But in either case, if employees are taking their temperatures at home, you want to make sure that they're trained, that they have access to all the equipment that they need, that they know what your procedure is for taking their temperature and reporting it into work. Next slide. If you're going to do it at work, there's several ways you can do it. You can find someone at work who can do it. If someone has medical training, that's great. There are people you can hire to come in and do it. Larger workplaces are doing that. You can train someone to do it. But whoever's taking the temperatures, they're going to be exposed to people who potentially have symptoms and have COVID. So they need to have personal protective equipment, including a mask. That's really important. And as you set out to do this, you need to make sure you have all the equipment. And if you haven't already started, you need to start today. You need to make sure you have thermometers, cleaning supplies. For the thermometers, they have to be cleaned between every temperature taking, everything you need. Next. Some other things to keep in mind is you don't want to create a risk by doing temperature taking. So for example, if you did temperature taking and had everybody line up in the front of the business all in a crowd to get their temperatures taken in the morning, that would be a problem because you would not have social distancing, you would have a crowd, you would have people potentially spreading. So you've got to do all the same things you're doing in the workplace in terms of distancing people, having lanes, one person at a time. So you can either have a separate place where they go, or whatever you do, you need to make sure that there's social distancing and not crowds. You could do it outside. Some employers are doing that. You could have drive-through temperature taking. You could have a trailer. You can have them come inside the facility. That's the least preferable method. But if they do come inside, do it immediately when they come inside, because if they go all the way into the workplace before you discover they have a temperature, then everyone is potentially exposed. So you want to do that as quickly as possible before people become exposed to the rest of the workers. Next slide. If someone doesn't pass either the temperature screening or symptom screening, you need to have procedures about sending them home and when they'll be cleared to come back. That's really critical, and that's done even-handedly across the workplace. Next. You need to follow up with the employee who hasn't passed, see if they've had testing. You need to, if they've been exposed to other employees, you need to notify all of those employees that they've potentially been exposed. And then you need to have specific criteria about when they can return to work. In this slide, you'll see exactly what the CDC says about returning to work. It's kind of an either-or, either a situation where they don't have symptoms for a certain amount of time, or they have documentation from a medical provider. Those are the only two situations where they should be coming back to work after they've had a temperature or otherwise failed the symptom check or exposure check. So once you've kind of decided on what you're going to do with symptom checking, you should have a written policy. That's something we can help with if you need. Choose someone to run the program. Make sure everyone knows in advance so there are no surprises, and do a dry run so you can kind of figure out what the hiccups are in your system in advance. You also need to realize that employees have to be compensated for screening time under federal labor laws. And if someone truly refuses to participate in this, then you're going to have to take action. I mean, don't do it lightly, but people do have to participate. It is required. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about
Hey, Christina.
Yes.
Can I interject real quickly? There's a couple of questions that have come in.
Yeah.
That you could perhaps address really quickly. One question is, how would you ensure accurate temperatures if taken at home?
Yeah, so it kind of, like I said, it depends on your business. I think some businesses should not allow people to do it at home. I read the Utah guidelines, for example, is requiring restaurants to really have the manager do it at work. But assuming you've decided you're okay doing it at home, there's several things you can do. You can just trust employees to take their own temperatures and report it. You can have them take a photo of the temperature reading and send it in to you. You can have them do it over FaceTime or Zoom with you. That would be a way of knowing that they're doing it and yet being pretty safe. So I hope that answers your question. Those are
Great, thank you very much. And one other question was, do you have any app recommendations for symptom checking?
So I use the Utah app. I'm forgetting the name right off the top of my head. Utah Healthy Together, something like that. I use that app. It has the symptoms that Utah is tracking, so that's a really good one. There aren't any others that I have really used. Does anyone else have any that they recommend? Nope. Okay. Yeah. So that's, there are others out there for sure, but that's the one I use. So in terms of high risk or vulnerable employees, this is really important. There's no way this going back to work is ever going to work if we can't protect the people who are most at risk. And that means the people who, if they contract COVID, they're going to get really sick or they're going to die. So older employees, people with certain diseases, again, this is another situation where the list is always changing, so you've got to keep up with it. But that's what we're trying to protect. Next. And again, this is a really tricky area because, normally we don't get to ask people about these sort of situations. We don't get to ask people if they have health conditions, but this is different. And as Utah is going into the orange phase, Utah has actually said that high-risk individuals you should exercise extreme caution. And this is a quote right from the Utah regulations. The Utah employers should provide special accommodations for these employees if they're high risk. They should stay at home if they can, work from home. If they cannot work from home and have to come into the workplace, you need to do other things to make sure that they're extra protected. So of course, you can't just treat people differently. You can't just say, okay, well, older workers, we're not going to put you on shifts. You're not going to get paid for now. Pregnant people, people with health conditions, we're just not going to include you in your workforce because that's safer for us and for you. That's discrimination. And I know that's really tricky because you can't discriminate and yet you have to protect these people. And it is really tough. So what can you do? What I'm really advising employers to do is change their ADA policies to encourage employees to self-identify that they're in a high-risk group. You can't go up to an employee and say, are you high risk? Do you have an underlying health condition? But you can certainly encourage them to tell you that. And if they do tell you that, then there's things you can do to accommodate them. Of course, keeping them at home if you can and still paying them, jobs they can do at home. If you're only having some people come back and some people work at home, then you should let high-risk people stay at home. Other things you can do in terms of extra social distancing, extra cleaning, changing schedules, really trying your best to make sure that those people have at least contact with other individuals. If employees self-disclose a health condition, then they're basically self-disclosing that they potentially have a disability under the ADA. And if you have more than 15 employees, you're required under the ADA to have an interactive dialogue with them about their condition, whether they need special accommodations, talk to them about potential things you can do to help make it safer for them. Next. So sometimes I get the question, what if an employee refuses to work? And I always say, proceed cautiously, have a conversation with that employee about why they're refusing to work. On the one hand, it might turn out that you have that conversation with someone and they have a disability, they have one of these high-risk conditions, and then you should be talking to them about what sort of accommodations you can do. It also might be that they just don't want to come to work, they're just scared, and there's nothing you can do to make them feel safe. And it might be that you just have to, part ways. But obviously you want to be very careful in that situation to make sure you're doing everything you're required to under the law. Okay, that's all I have for now. Sean, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Christina. So I'm going to talk a little bit about personal protective equipment. Before the pandemic hit, only the people that were really worried about personal protective equipment were people in certain manufacturing industries, mining industries, industries or workplaces where employees were exposed potentially to toxic chemicals or other dangers. But now it's obviously with COVID-19, it's become much more of a broader issue. We've got a number of slides here that kind of talk generally about and give you some fair amount of detail about PPE. And before COVID-19, the rules you found were rules that were done by OSHA. And OSHA, those rules determined what industries PPE should be applicable to, what employees should wear as part of PPE, and also how to train employees how to wear PPE in different environments. Well, with COVID-19, in particular in the state of Utah, as in moving from red to orange, and as well Susan and Christina have talked about, obviously employers and having employees wear masks has become essentially a required item by the state of Utah, and employers generally should be providing their employees with masks, face coverings of some sort, and the type of mask that you should be applying or should be providing to your employees really determines on the industry. For most industries, these kind of general face coverings, which is the example on the slide right here, is appropriate. For the medical industry, there are different types of masks that are required, and those are masks that are essentially called respirators, and those are masks that have the ability to essentially filter out the air that the employee is wearing. So the first slide showed a mask, and that was not a respirator, and those masks generally are to prevent an employee from spreading the illness, the face coverings. But with the respirators, those also enable and protect the employee from themselves inhaling or getting the virus themselves. So it has a dual protective effect when you have a respirator, and that is it prevents the employee from making others sick, and it prevents the individual who's wearing the respirator from getting sick themselves. Respirators are not required to be provided to employees by employers in Utah, unless you are in the medical industry. In the medical industry, respirators are required. In other industries, they are not. The key with the face coverings and what kind of the takeaway message goes back to what Susan and Christina have already talked about, and that is make sure that you are providing these, but also make sure you are creating documentation regarding the training you're doing of how to properly wear these face masks, documentation regarding any kind of disciplinary actions you're going to take against employees who do not follow the guidelines. The whole purpose of what we have talked about today is to provide a safe work environment for your employees, but also to make sure that in following these guidelines, you are insulating yourself from potential liability, which is what Christina began this presentation talking about. As employment lawyers, the thing we do, what we've done, three of us for, each of us approximately 20 years, is to advise employers how to manage and minimize risk from their employees. This is no different. It's just a different context. And so in providing PPE, a couple of the things that people might not be thinking about is making sure that you document the training that you are providing to your employees, about how to properly use the PPE, and also the disciplinary actions you might take against employees if they don't follow the directives, if they don't wear PPE. You know, members have been to stores and you see employees that are wearing masks, but they might be having the mask underneath their nose, or they might be having their mask around their neck. What kind of disciplinary processes, what kind of disciplinary actions is an employer going to take against that employee? Have that mapped out, have that documented, so that if you ever have an employee who brings a claim, if you ever have a customer that brings a claim, you can show the evidence, you can show the exhibits that here's what we told our employees to do, and here's the disciplinary actions that we told them we would take if they didn't follow it. So we were prepared, we tried our best to make sure that we kept our employees safe and our customers safe. And these slides have a bunch of detailed information about PPE and also about OSHA guidelines. You can take a look at those when we send out the slide deck. So let's now go on to, in the interest of time, go on to what do you do if an employee tests positive? And that's something that I think is going to be a ever-increasing issue. You know, most businesses have been closed the last few weeks. As businesses open back up, to whatever degree they decide to open back up, you're going to have employees that are going to test positive for COVID-19. This virus is not going away anytime soon, so this is going to be an ongoing issue. And how you react to that and what you do in response to that is important. The first thing you obviously need to do, and again, I'm kind of repeating what has already been said, to make sure you have a policy about how you're going to react and what you're going to do when an employee tests positive for COVID-19. And Jason, you can skip a few slides. I didn't go over these detailed slides. People can go over those and send out the slide deck. So if you want to skip a few slides going forward, there you go. Keep on going. Keep on going. Keep on going. Keep on going. There we go. Okay. So, as Christina mentioned, you know, in normal times, we would never be talking about or never encouraging employers to be testing employees or asking their employees about different illnesses or symptoms of different illnesses, except in certain circumstances that are specified in the ADA. But the EEOC has said with this COVID-19 pandemic that it's perfectly appropriate, and it is in no small measure almost a requirement that employers take seriously the obligations to test their employees and make sure that no one is allowed at the workplace that has tested positive for COVID-19. So the first thing you need to think about is, you know, when employees are coming back, you've got your plan created, you're doing your temperature checking. One of the things you can also do before allowing employees to come back to the workplace is to require them to be tested for COVID-19. There are a number of testing centers throughout the state of Utah. You can find them on the state's website, which is down here, coronavirus.utah.gov. And if you go to that website, there's a number of locations on the interactive map that show you where an employee can get tested. The one thing that is interesting that I found looking at the state website that's a little bit different than the CDC guidelines. Christina talked about some of the CDC guidelines of symptoms and how they've expanded, but some of the symptoms were standalone. Some of them had to be in groups. The state of Utah, the Department of Health has essentially said employees should be tested if they have any of the following symptoms: if they have a fever, a cough, shortness of breath, muscle pains and aches, a sore throat, a decreased sense of smell or taste. So if any employee is exhibiting any of those types of symptoms, the state health department says you should encourage them to get testing. Next slide. So these are just a couple of comments about things to think about with regard to testing. I think if you go ahead and, you know, the EEOC guidelines talk about employers testing employees on their own. I don't think that's even possible right now in Utah, and I think it's a better approach at this juncture would be to send employees to a testing center that's identified by the state of Utah as an appropriate testing center. Again, as Christina mentioned, you have to compensate employees for the time that they spend getting testing. Next slide. Okay, so you've got an employee. What happens when they test positive? The first thing, I think it's a good thing to remember is be humane, empathize. This is obviously going to be a traumatic event for a number of employees, and try to express, empathy and be humane about it. You need to obviously follow the CDC guidance. That's what we've been talking about. This whole presentation is make sure you follow the applicable guidance. And the CDC has given guidance about what you should do if an employee in a workplace tests positive for COVID-19. First thing you need to do is, once you become aware of that, is you need to send the employee home. They should not be allowed in the workplace. And they should be sent home for 14 days or until CDC guidance says they are safe to return to work. And I think Christina mentioned that. There's a few alternative tests that employers can employ to look at and determine whether an employee is safe to return to work. Next slide. When you have an employee that tests positive, it's kind of a good time as an employer to determine and see whether you've got the adequate policies in place. Do you have policies in place to test all employees quickly? Do you have policies in place to allow employees to work remotely if they test positive for COVID-19 but still might be able to work if they want to? Did you instigate staggered shifts to make sure everyone is not exposed all at once? Did you follow the applicable cleaning guidelines? It's a good time to kind of check yourself and check to make sure that you have implemented all the appropriate policies, and if you have not, to then implement those policies. Next slide. A couple of other things to think about, and Christina talked about workers' compensation, and generally COVID-19 exposure, COVID-19 illness is not going to be covered by workers' compensation law. But if you have an employee that does test positive for COVID-19, we did a webinar a few days ago with an insurance agency, and they sell workers' compensation policies, and they encourage employers to go ahead and file workers' compensation claims or have their employees file workers' compensation claims if they get exposed to COVID-19. It's probably going to be denied, but there's really no harm in having the employee make the claim. You should record the incident in your OSHA log if an employee tests positive for COVID-19. You also need to consider whether the employee is eligible for the sick leave benefits under the FFCRA. They're likely going to be eligible for at least some, if not all of those benefits. And making sure that you have an FFCRA leave policy in place is important. Another consideration is that your short-term disability policy apply. Next slide. Okay, so after the employee tests positive, it's really important that you then figure out and try to do contact tracing with that employee. Who has the employee interacted with? Who has the employee potentially exposed to COVID-19? And with those individuals, either have them self-quarantine for a period of 14 days or have them be tested to make sure that they are not also positive COVID-19. It's really important that you have not just the employee that tested positive be quarantined, but anyone that he or she came into contact with, either for them to quarantine or for them to be tested. That's the key to controlling the outbreak, as we all know. Well, none of us are doctors, but we've heard enough about this. But making sure that you identify the people who have the virus and you contact trace and you make sure that the people they have come in contact with are either self-quarantined or that they are tested to make sure that they are also not positive. You need to notify those other employees that have potentially been exposed without revealing the identity of the employee who tested positive. Just tell them, there's been someone at the workplace who has tested positive for COVID-19. You may have been exposed. Please self-quarantine or get yourself tested. And then you need to think about making sure that you establish the rules for returning to work. Again, the CDC has guidelines about when an employee can return to work after being infected with COVID-19. Next slide. Okay, I think that's mine. That's all that I have. If you have any questions about returning to work, please send them to the chat line and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the specific guidelines that have been put out by Utah Leads Together 2.0 regarding some of the areas that you're all in. Definitely look at those guidelines. I think they were earlier in Susan's slides, the link to the Utah guidelines. There's some general guidelines that apply to all employers, and then there's some that are specific to different industries. So you'll want to look at both the general guidelines and the industry-specific ones. And I'm not going to go over all of the guidelines. I've tried to pick out some that are specific to employers and employees and that relationship. There's other guidelines, obviously, that apply to customers and just general business operations. But some of the things that are generally applicable to employers are face coverings that Sean already talked about being worn at all times in public settings. Employees should continue to work remotely if they can. I don't think everyone realizes that if people are working remotely and can continue to do so, they should, and obviously, especially if they're high risk. Businesses that are high contact, like restaurants, like hotels, like a lot of the hospitality industries, can only open if they can do so under very strict protocols that you need to be familiar with. Restaurants are now free to open up dine-in services, but again, under very strict requirements. I'm sure you've heard a lot about those. They're, really suggesting that you do symptom checking in those business interactions, and that there are some certifications that you can get if you'd like as a business, and those have to be displayed if you get them. The employer should also be evaluating workplace strategies, concerns, and doing everything they can to minimize economic impact and also minimize the health risk to their employees. Okay, next. So the general guidelines, again, talk about extreme caution, working remotely, if you have on-site work, making sure that you're monitoring your workforce for symptoms, and we talked a lot about that, providing accommodations for high-risk employees. We talked about that, symptom checking. The really big thing is face coverings have to be worn if you can't have 6 feet of distancing, and really are the best recommendation because you can't always guarantee 6 feet distancing. Also making sure that those face coverings are available to your employees. Next. In terms of the hospitality, tourism, and accommodations industry, those kind of industries have to take extreme precautions for both their staff and their guests. Staff and guests have to wear face coverings, and you should also be considering plexiglass partitions. For example, if you have a check-in process at your hotel, that would be one place where there's a lot of potential interaction, and plexiglass would be very helpful. In events and entertainment, again, this is theoretically allowable now if there's increased cleaning operation protocols that allow the distancing. The distancing is very tricky, obviously. They're suggesting 10-foot distance be maintained between individual household groups in these types of entertainment venues. So that's pretty difficult. For dine-in restaurants, again, they can open with extreme precautions, with physical distancing and staff monitoring. One of the things that it says in the Utah guidelines is that the manager should check each employee for symptoms before each shift, including temperature taking and asking members if they've tested positive, if they've had any exposure, the things that we kind of went over before. Now, it does specifically say in this part of the Utah leads that it should be managers performing that. Now, I don't think that ever means you couldn't deviate from that, but I think the point really is that they want someone very responsible doing this, not, putting a 16-year-old kid on your shift in charge of this sort of thing. You have to keep logs of temperature checking and symptom checking available for the local health officer to check, and staff have to wear face covering at all times and perform hand hygiene between interactions at tables if you're going to have in open dining. For dining in restaurants, you also cannot operate unless you have the PPE that you need and the EPA-approved disinfectants that Sean talked a little bit about. So those are really critical. They're telling restaurants that they need to stagger workstations so employees are not facing each other and can stay 6 feet apart. and that the employers provide all the PPE that they need: face coverings, hairnets, gloves, and overalls. I've never seen overalls worn in a dine-in restaurant, but that's what the guidance says. So if anyone knows anything about that, I'd be curious to know what that you think that means. Okay, next. All right, so those are the specific guidance about employees in those industries. We're happy to answer any questions if anyone has anything for us now. Jason, did anything roll in?
Yeah, we've got a question here. Can we enforce to have every employee use the app Healthy Together and send their daily diagnostic by email to the employer?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. The Utah guidelines say that you should encourage all employees to use the app. They don't say that you can force them to. So then the question is, well, can you anyway force them to? You certainly can require employees to do symptom checking with you. And one way you could do it is through the app, but you can't go beyond asking them about symptoms and exposure. So I think it would be a little risky, for example, to require employees to use the app, which geolocates them anywhere they go after work hours. If you did that, there could be some privacy concerns. So I probably wouldn't go that far.
Thanks, Christina. Here's another question. If you're an employer and your workspace already is conducive to social distancing, people are spread apart, there's good distance between everyone, as an employer, do you still need to provide employees with masks?
I think the best recommendation is to provide everyone with masks. You might have different rules about when they have to wear them. For example, like in a lawyer's office where people go into private offices and shut the door, maybe you don't need them to wear it when they shut the door. But if they're going to be walking around in community space, I would probably say yes. What do you think, Sean? You talked about masks a bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment because I think it goes back to what Susan talked about. There's a little bit of confusion in the Utah guidelines between must and should. And the guidelines talking about masks, there's a particular reference to masks should be worn where physical distancing, particularly where physical distancing can't be accomplished. But I still think, and I agree with you, that the best practice is to have employees wear masks. I mean, there's no way, unless there is a significant downside or some very compelling reason for them to not wear masks, which is hard to imagine at this point, I would encourage employees to wear masks, even if you have distancing in the workplace.
Great, thanks, Sean. Another question, and I'll point this at you, Sean, regarding PPE or personal protective equipment. If you're taking temperatures at your place of business, should the individual that is taking the temperature of employees coming into the workplace be wearing a respirator? And what other types of protective equipment should be provided to that employee?
Yeah, I think at a minimum a respirator, also thinking about maybe a face shield, gloves, and as Christina talked about, the overalls, the outer clothing that can be removed. And I think that person needs to, and Christina also obviously can talk about what that person should be provided, but that's me, need to be providing them with significant amount of PPE, and those are the things that I think would be appropriate. And that is respirators, face shield, and gloves, and then also outer layer of clothing that they can remove after they're done temperature checking.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. Susan or Christina, any final comments from you before we wrap up today's presentation?
None for me. Thanks. Christina?
I just wanted to mention one thing. I mean, obviously, we all work in this area, and we're happy to help individual employers with policies, with procedures, with questions, advice you have. And then beyond that, if this group is interested in doing additional, like I mentioned at the beginning, additional webinars on specific topics, dive a little deeper into something in particular, we're happy to set those up. Just let Judy know.
Great, thank you, Christina. Well, as we mentioned at the very beginning of today's presentation, all of you will receive tomorrow a link to the recording of today's webcast. You will also receive a slide deck from the presenters. I'd like to extend a huge thanks on behalf of Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer to each and every one of you for joining us for today's webcast. And lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't extend a huge thanks to Judy Cullen and her team at Visit Salt Lake for co-hosting today's presentation with us. So Judy, thank you for having us, and we wish each and every one of you all the very best.
Thank you, Jason, and a big thanks from Visit Salt Lake to Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer as well. I think this information was extremely valuable. I know I learned a lot, and it seems like every day we're learning something new. Just to echo what Jason said, please feel free to reach out to me if there's a particular topic that you would like to see the team at Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer delve into in a little bit more detail. Let me know, and we will be happy to get in contact with them and set that up. In the meantime, please everyone stay healthy and keep checking those emails from Visit Salt Lake for valuable information on upcoming webinars. So thank you, everyone, especially to our presenters today, for sharing this information with us.
Thank you, Judy. And again, stay healthy, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.